Nocteris Prime did not sleep. It merely vibrated with the constant, grinding hum of heavy industry. Below the golden clouds, the slums existed in a permanent state of twilight, choked by a thick, neon-tinted smog that clung to every surface like wet oil. Kael stood at his workbench, his fingers moving with practiced, mechanical rhythm. He held a soldering iron to the exposed circuitry of a discarded drone, the tip hissing as it fused wires. The factory floor was a maze of rusted metal and stagnant shadows. He pulled a loose connection, felt the resistance, and forced it back into place. It was a cycle without end. Repair the broken, discard the useless, repeat until the lights failed. Outside the grimy panes of the factory windows, the city pulse shook the walls, a low-frequency thrum that rattled the spare parts on his desk. He wiped grease from his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of black across his skin. The air tasted of ozone and burnt plastic. Every breath felt heavy, weighed down by the sheer density of the haze. Here, in the belly of the machine, progress was a myth, and hope was just another component waiting to be scrapped. Kael pushed open the heavy steel door of the factory, stepping out into the narrow alleyway. The rain here was dark, oily, and cold, slickening the uneven pavement. He navigated the labyrinth of pipes and hanging cables, his boots splashing through shallow, iridescent puddles. He climbed 3 flights of stairs, the metal risers groaning under his weight, until he reached the door to their home. He paused, hand on the rusted handle, listening to the muffled, rhythmic thud of the city's machinery deep underground. He pushed inside. The room was small, a singular space carved out of the industrial sprawl. Lena stood by the window, watching the distant, flickering lights of the upper levels. She turned as he entered, her face catching the dim glow of a failing neon sign outside. She smiled, a simple, quiet expression that cut through the gloom of the sector. For a moment, the weight of the day vanished. He set his tools down on the floor, the metal clicking against the concrete. She moved toward him, her presence the only steady thing in a world that felt like it was constantly shifting. They stood together in the center of the cramped room, the air silent and still, separated from the chaos of the slums by a thin, vibrating wall. They sat at a small, scarred metal table, the surface vibrating in time with the city's heavy, rhythmic pulse. Kael broke a synthetic nutrient block in half, the sound sharp in the cramped room. He pushed a portion toward Lena. The walls groaned as a massive turbine somewhere below the foundations surged, sending a tremor through the floorboards. A cup of water skidded an inch toward the edge of the table, and Kael reached out to steady it, his hand pressing firmly against the cold metal. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, drifting down into their bowls like gray snow. They ate in silence, the rhythm of the city dictating the pace of their movements. Every time the pulse spiked, the cutlery rattled against the plates, a constant, abrasive reminder of the industrial weight pressing down from all sides. The room felt smaller with every vibration, the air thick with the hum of machinery that never truly stopped. Kael watched the water in his cup ripple in perfect, synchronized patterns, a reflection of the grid that held them captive. There was no escape from the thrum. It was in the floor, the walls, and the very air they breathed, a physical manifestation of the poverty that defined their existence. Lena rose from the table, her plate left half-finished. She walked to the window, the only aperture in their room that looked toward the surface. She pressed her palms against the cold, grime-streaked glass. Outside, the industrial smog hung thick and suffocating, but her focus cut through the haze. High above the clouds, the golden skyscrapers of the elite pierced the gloom, their lights steady and brilliant. She did not blink. Her breathing slowed, becoming shallow and rhythmic as she watched the distant spires. Kael stood near the table, his hands still stained with grease, watching the back of her head. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but stopped, his fingers hovering in the air. She was a world away. Her eyes traced the lines of the floating structures, following the movement of airships that looked like glittering needles against the dark sky. She shifted her weight, leaning further into the glass, as if she could physically bridge the gap between their suffocating room and that impossible horizon. The silence between them grew, weighted by the vast distance she had placed in her own mind. She remained there for a long time, utterly motionless, her posture rigid, eyes reflecting a light that did not exist in their sector of the city. A sudden burst of light fractured the smog outside. A massive holographic billboard flickered into existence, suspended in the heavy air between the towers. It projected a landscape of impossible clarity, clear blue skies, lush greenery, and people moving with effortless, unburdened grace. The light bled into their room, washing over the walls in synthetic shades of gold and cyan. Lena's face illuminated, her features softening as the projection cast a vibrant, artificial glow across her skin. The advertisements cycled through promises, displaying crystalline water and golden spires that defied the gravity of the slums. She leaned forward, her forehead nearly touching the glass, her pupils dilating to absorb the flickering, seductive motion. Kael looked at the floor, the harsh, shifting colors stinging his eyes. He watched the light dance across the grease stains on his hands, a stark contrast to the perfect, scrubbed images hovering in the sky. Lena reached out, tracing the outline of a virtual bridge on the window pane. Her fingers moved in sync with the shifting hologram, catching the light like a moth. The room felt suddenly hollow, the noise of the factory fading beneath the visual roar of the advertisement. She was no longer looking at the city. She was looking at a mirage, and it held her gaze with a grip that felt absolute. The heavy drone of the city's ventilation fans stuttered, then faded into a low, rhythmic hum. Down in the narrow alleyway, the usual cacophony of metal on metal ceased. A black transport vehicle drifted silently through the thick, oily fog, its surface so polished it reflected the grime of the slums like a dark mirror. It ignored the uneven stone, gliding with a calculated, smooth precision that defied the broken terrain. People in the street pressed themselves back against the rusted corrugated walls, eyes shifting toward the ground. The vehicle halted at the corner, blocking the exit. A door hissed open, releasing a draft of chilled, sterile air that smelled of ozone and filtered oxygen. Walther stepped out, his boots making a sharp, rhythmic sound against the wet pavement. He surveyed the narrow corridor with a slow, deliberate movement of his head, his gaze sweeping over the debris and the hollowed-out faces of the workers. He did not touch anything. He did not acknowledge the filth. He stood as a pillar of stillness amidst the decay, his presence draining the air from the street. He took a single step forward, his eyes fixed on the small, flickering light of the apartment window above, and the entire block seemed to shrink away from the weight of his attention. Walther climbed the rusted stairs with a fluid, measured pace that made the structure groan. He reached the threshold of their room, his movements precise and unhurried. He stood in the doorway, blocking the dim, flickering light of the hallway. Lena turned, her initial confusion replaced by a sharp, sudden stillness. Walther did not speak immediately. He reached into a pocket and produced a small, translucent cube that pulsed with a soft, warm rhythm. He held it out. It hovered in his palm, casting a steady amber glow that pushed back the shadows of the room. Lena took a tentative step toward him, her hands trembling. He spoke in a voice low enough to slide under the sound of the city, describing the heights above the clouds where the air was pure and the machines never broke. He placed the cube in her hand. The device hummed, a sound of perfect, undisturbed operation. Lena looked from the glowing object to the window, then back to the man in her doorway. She did not look at Kael. She gripped the cube tightly, her knuckles whitening. Ambition's exit eclipsed history. She neared Walther, hearing his offer, turning from Kael. Kael stood back in the deep shadow of the alley, his fingers curled tightly around the edge of a rusted pipe. He watched the apartment window, the amber light from the cube spilling out to paint the grime of the street in a sickly, artificial hue. He saw Lena lean toward the man in the doorway, her head tilted, her focus entirely captured by the stranger. Kael opened his mouth to call her name, but the sound died in his throat. He saw her hand move, stroking the surface of the glowing device, a gesture of ownership he had never seen her display toward anything in their home. The air around him felt thin, stripped of its heat. He watched her posture shift, her body angling away from the inside of the room and toward the hallway, toward the man who promised a life beyond the smog. Every movement she made was a rejection of the life they had carved from the ruins. Kael pressed his back into the wet brick, his heart hammering against his ribs, yet his limbs felt leaden, paralyzed by the sight of her transformation. She was drifting away, pulled by a current he could not fight, leaving him to anchor himself to a reality she no longer recognized. He stayed in the dark, watching the light, until the silence of the street became a physical weight pressing him down. Lena emerged from the building, her pace swift and purposeful. She ignored the puddles, her gaze fixed on the street level. Above, the rain fell in heavy, gray sheets, turning the industrial sludge into a slick, dark mirror. A hum vibrated through the ground, deeper and smoother than the constant drone of the factory generators. A vehicle detached itself from the gloom, its exterior polished to a mirror finish that refused to hold the grime of the district. It slowed to a silent stop exactly where she stood. The passenger door hissed open, spilling a sharp, sterile white light onto the wet pavement. Lena hesitated for a single heartbeat, the rain soaking her hair, her eyes scanning the street one last time. Kael remained motionless in the shadows, his knuckles white against the cold stone. She stepped inside. The door pulled shut with a soft, final click, cutting off the sound of the storm. The vehicle accelerated, tires gripping the slick road with impossible traction, and slid away into the dark. Kael watched the taillights fade until they were just another set of distant, unreachable stars. He stood alone in the downpour, the silence of the street now absolute and suffocating. Kael climbed the stairs, the metal treads groaning under his weight. He entered the apartment, expecting to find the remnants of their life, but the space felt hollow. Lena was there, yet she occupied the room like a ghost. She moved toward the window, her back to him, staring at the distant, golden glow of the upper spires. He set his tools on the workbench, the metallic clatter sounding sharp and intrusive in the heavy silence. He waited for her to turn, for the usual rhythm of their evening to return, but she remained motionless. He began to repair a drone, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, yet his focus drifted to the empty space where she used to sit. The air in the room was cold, carrying the metallic tang of the city's smog through the gaps in the wall. He spoke, but his words felt thin, dissolving before they reached her. She offered no reply, only a slight tilt of her head. The pulse of the city outside vibrated through the floorboards, a rhythmic thud that filled the gaps where their voices once lived. They were two strangers, sharing a cage, the distance between them growing with every passing, silent hour. Kael finally dropped his tools. The metallic ring hit the floor, echoing against the damp walls. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked toward the window where Lena stood fixed in her observation of the sky. He stopped 3 paces behind her. The hum of the city outside felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass. He spoke, his voice barely a rasp over the ventilation grind. "Are you happy here, Lena?" The question hung in the stagnant air, unmoving. He watched the back of her neck, the way she stiffened, the way she refused to turn. Seconds bled into one another. 1, then 5, then 10. The silence grew thick, suffocating, turning the room into a vacuum. She gripped the windowsill until her knuckles turned ivory, but she did not answer. The hesitation stretched, a vast, empty canyon opening between them that no amount of shared history could bridge. Kael watched her profile, seeing the reflection of the golden towers in her eyes. She finally drew a shallow, trembling breath, but the words did not come. She did not need to speak. The heavy pause was a verdict. She had already left, and he was staring at a stranger. The silence in the room solidified. Lena turned, not to face him, but toward the corner where a small bag sat on the floor. She knelt, her movements precise and devoid of hesitation. She gathered a few items, a data pad, a coil of wire, a frayed thermal sheet, and stuffed them into the bag. The sound of fabric against floorboards was the only noise left in the world. Kael remained by the window, his hands hanging limp at his sides. He watched the back of her head, tracking the rhythm of her breathing, waiting for a tremor or a sign of regret that never appeared. She stood, slung the strap over her shoulder, and walked past him. She did not brush his arm. She did not seek his gaze. She pushed the door open, the rusty hinges giving a long, high-pitched scream that vanished into the hallway. The door swung shut, clicking into its frame with a finality that made the walls seem to pull inward. A sudden draft swept through the gap beneath the door, carrying the biting, chemical chill of the slums. The room temperature plummeted. Kael reached out to touch the workbench, but the metal surface felt like ice against his skin. He stood in the center of the gloom, surrounded by the remnants of a life that had effectively ceased to exist. The apartment remained frozen, the only movement the slow flicker of a dying neon sign outside. Kael did not move until a sharp, rhythmic tapping sounded against the reinforced glass. He turned. A sleek silver drone hovered outside the window, its light pulsing with an unnatural, sterile blue. It tapped again, insistent, vibrating the frame. Kael unlocked the latch. The drone drifted inside, shedding a thin layer of frost as it hit the warmer, stagnant air of the room. It projected a holographic interface directly onto the workbench. A name appeared, floating in the air. Valther. A message followed, brief and cold. Your presence is required. The summit of the spire. Midnight. The hologram flickered, then vanished, leaving the room darker than before. Kael stared at the empty space where the light had been. This was not an invitation. It was a demand. A tether pulling him toward the very source of his ruin. He looked at his hands, still stained by the work he would never finish, then at the door through which he had vanished. He knew the risks. He knew the architecture of the spire was designed to crush anyone from the lower levels. He reached out and crushed the drone's power cell. The small machine went limp and fell to the floor. He grabbed his coat, stepped into the hallway, and began the long descent toward the elevators. The transit lift was a needle of chrome piercing through the layers of the city. Kael stepped inside. The doors sealed with a hiss of pressurized air that purged the smell of grease and damp rot from his lungs. As the lift began its climb, the floor vibrated beneath his boots, a low-frequency hum that climbed into his marrow. Outside the reinforced glass, the neon haze of the slums blurred into a smear of sickly violet, then vanished entirely. The air pressure dropped. Kael felt his ears pop, a sharp, stinging pain that forced him to grip the railing. The lift accelerated, surging upward until the lower levels were nothing but a distant, forgotten memory of shadow. Then, the light changed. The dim orange of the slums was replaced by a sterile, piercing white. The lift slowed, the movement turning from a roar to a whisper. It stopped. A chime echoed through the cabin, clear and demanding. The doors slid open with a sound like a blade cutting silk. Kael stepped out onto a floor of polished obsidian. The air here was thin, cold, and smelled of ozone and synthetic lilies. He stood on the edge of the summit, the vast, golden expanse of the spire stretching out before him like a sun-drenched graveyard. Kael walked across the obsidian floor, his boots making no sound against the seamless surface. The room was vast, an expanse of architectural arrogance that ignored the world below. At the far end, a massive wall of glass curved toward the horizon. Outside, a storm of unnatural intensity raged. Clouds of swirling gray and violet light collided, casting flickering shadows that pulsed against the glass like a dying heartbeat. Valther stood there, his back to the entrance, watching the turbulence. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a static hum that made the hair on Kael's arms stand up. Kael stopped 10 paces away. The silence stretched, filled only by the low, guttural roar of the wind against the structure. Valther turned slowly. The pleasant, practiced smile that had defined their previous encounters was gone. In its place was a sharp, hollow stillness. His eyes, fixed on Kael, held no recognition, only the cold, calculated intent of a predator deciding the exact moment to strike. The glass wall shuddered under the force of the gale, but the room itself held a deeper, more dangerous vibration. Valther shifted his weight. The air snapped with the sudden, sharp scent of ozone. He did not speak. He did not need to. Valther did not lunge. He did not reach out. He simply twitched his right wrist, a singular, sharp motion that sliced through the static air. An invisible wall of force slammed into Kael with the weight of a falling girder. The impact was absolute. Kael's feet left the polished obsidian floor, his body snapping backward as if struck by a physical hammer. He had no time to brace, no moment to gasp, only the sudden, violent realization that he was being discarded like refuse. The air rushed out of his lungs in a ragged wheeze. He flew through the center of the room, his limbs flailing, his balance utterly destroyed by the impossible pressure, his vision tunneled, the world blurring into a chaotic swirl of gray light and dark shadows. He saw Valther's hand drop back to his side, the movement fluid and indifferent. Every muscle in Kael's frame burned as he hurtled toward the curvature of the glass wall. The distance between him and the barrier closed in a heartbeat. He was no longer a guest in this high-altitude sanctuary. He was debris, being swept out of existence by a flick of a finger. The force behind him pushed harder, unrelenting, driving him toward the inevitable collision with the threshold of the abyss. The impact came with the sound of a thunderclap. Kael hit the glass wall, but the material did not bend. Instead, it fractured. A web of white, jagged lines raced outward from his point of contact, spiderwebbing across the entire span in a heartbeat. The noise was deafening, a high-pitched, crystalline shriek that drowned out the wind. Then, the wall gave way. It did not just break. It detonated into a million razor-sharp diamonds. The air pressure in the room shifted instantly, sucking the oxygen out as the exterior storm rushed in to fill the void. Kael felt the sharp sting of debris against his skin before the floor beneath him simply ceased to exist. He was shoved through the frame, weightless for a fraction of a second, surrounded by a swirling cloud of glass shards that caught the neon light of the city like 1,000 tiny mirrors. He looked back, once, through the chaos of the spray, and saw the jagged outline of the hole he had created. Beyond it, the room was already fading, replaced by the rushing cold of the upper atmosphere. Gravity reclaimed him. He tipped forward, his center of gravity shifting toward the void, and began the long descent into the dark, churning expanse below. The sky was not a destination. It was a hungry, rushing weight. Kael plummeted, his body carving a path through the freezing air. The wind roared, a deafening, constant scream that vibrated in his teeth and rattled his ribs. He tried to twist his frame, to catch the air and slow the descent, but the pressure was too immense. He was a stone dropped into a well that had no bottom. Below him, the neon sprawl of the city began to distort. The static lights of the industrial slums smeared into long, jagged streaks of white and violet, stretching across his vision like burning wires. His skin felt tight, pulled by the sheer velocity of the fall. The cold was absolute, biting through his layers, numbing his hands until he could barely feel his own grip. He watched the horizon spin a dizzying carousel of clouds and steel. Every second, the ground rushed closer, yet it remained a distant, impossible dream. He was suspended in a vertical tunnel of noise and light, a singular point of failure falling toward a city that had never known his name. The air grew thicker, denser, pressing against his chest with enough force to steal his breath. He stopped fighting the wind and let the acceleration take him, his eyes wide and unblinking as the world dissolved into a blur of blinding, lethal motion. The brilliant streaks of light began to dim as he punched through the cloud layer. The air shifted from freezing wind to a thick, oily sludge that clung to his skin and choked his lungs. He was passing into the lower levels, where the sky was only a rumor and the horizon was made of rusted steel. The vibrant neon glow of the upper city vanished, replaced by a suffocating, heavy gloom. Here, the smog was so dense it turned the world into a monochromatic nightmare of charcoal and soot. Kael reached out, his fingers brushing against the turbulent air, but there was nothing to hold on to. He was sinking into the lungs of the city. The roar of his descent deepened, turning into a low, guttural thrum that vibrated through his very bones. Below, the industrial architecture emerged from the mist, jagged, skeletal towers that seemed to reach up to meet him like grasping fingers. He was no longer falling through the sky. He was being consumed by the abyss. The shadows grew teeth. The light from his own trajectory flickered and died, snuffed out by the sheer density of the smog. He closed his eyes as the final remnants of the upper world receded, leaving him alone in the absolute, crushing darkness of the slums. The impact never came. He braced for the shattering of bone and the end of his life, but the collision dissolved into a hollow, soundless vibration. He was falling, yet he had stopped. He was moving, yet he was suspended. The crushing pressure of the atmosphere evaporated in an instant, replaced by a strange, weightless silence that pressed against his eardrums. There was no ground, no steel, no smog. There was only the absence of everything. Kael opened his eyes, but the darkness was not the charcoal soot of the slums. It was a deep, velvet void that stretched toward infinity. The roar of the city, the wind, his own heartbeat all gone. A cold, sterile stillness filled the space, as if the universe had paused its own mechanics. He hovered in a vacuum where distance lost its meaning. Time itself felt brittle, like paper about to tear. He reached out, but his hands met nothing but empty, static air. The frantic terror of the fall drained away, leaving behind a hollow, pulsating clarity. He was no longer in the city. He was nowhere at all, drifting in the quiet, expansive gap between the last breath of his life and whatever lay beyond the final threshold of existence. The void began to glow. Thin, crystalline filaments ignited in the darkness, spiderwebbing across the expanse. Kael watched as they tightened, pulling into view a sequence of images that hung in the air like suspended glass. He saw the factory floor, the flickering neon of the apartment, and the precise moment Valther stepped into his life. Each thread was anchored to his own skin, trailing back into the unseen distance. He tugged at one, and the memory of Lena's hesitation played back, not as a choice, but as a reaction to a subtle, invisible pressure. He saw Valther standing in the shadows of his own history, pulling levers that Kael had never even noticed. His life was not a series of accidents or struggles. It was a calibrated performance. The betrayal, the poverty, the fall itself, they were all synchronized, moving toward a predetermined conclusion. He tracked the filaments upward. They did not lead to the sky or to any human power. They vanished into a shimmering, shifting lattice that governed the geometry of his world. He was a puppet, and the stage was a cage designed to test the limits of his endurance. The truth was not a weight, but a cold, sharp realization that cut through his confusion. He had been a player in a game where the rules were written by invisible hands. The lattice hummed. It was a low, grinding sound that vibrated against Kael's ribcage. Before he could reach for another thread, the light shifted from white to a deep, bruised violet. The crystalline filaments shattered into dust, leaving him suspended in a pressurized silence. Then, the vibration intensified. It was not a sound heard with ears, but a frequency forced into his marrow. It carried the density of dying stars and the cold clarity of a vacuum. "You have served the design well," the voice echoed, emanating from the very space he occupied. It was ancient, layered, and devoid of empathy. It did not ask for his attention. It commanded his consciousness. Kael felt his identity thinning, stretched across the vastness of the void. "The narrative is complete," the voice continued, the words rolling like tectonic plates. "But the outcome remains unwritten." A golden fracture opened in the center of the dark. It offered a doorway back to the factory, back to the rain, back to the moments before he hit the pavement. "Do you seek to rewrite your fate?" The choice hung in the air, a singular, sharp point of potential. Kael felt the gravity of his own existence pulling him toward the light, the demand for an answer vibrating through the absolute stillness of his soul. Kael stared at the golden fracture. He did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his hand passing through the light. The sensation was not heat, but the sudden, absolute removal of every memory of comfort.